This is a new tape, new tape, new tape.
And when we got out of the mass meeting...
You and Bob Moses.
Right. And George Green, I don't know if you spoke to George.
I don't think so, no.
And I think James Peacock, the four of us, we got into the car. There were 3 cars with white men. They had guns hanging out the windows. And George started off driving. He got up to about 120. And Bob turned around and said, John, you got slow. He told him, why are you driving so fast? George said, God damn it, Moses, we're being chased. And Bob looked back and we could just see the headlights, you know.
It's at night.
Yeah, he said, well, they won't bother us. And Bob turned over and went to sleep. So James and I, sitting in the back, our knees were knocking, you know, and Bob went to sleep.
Let's turn to some matters of your personal history, Mr. Carmichael. Where were you born?
I was born in Trinidad, West Indies.
Trinidad, West Indies. And when did you come to this country?
I came when I was about 10 or 11.
You have some recollection of that life as contrasted with this one, do you then?
Very much so. I've been doing a lot of thinking about it lately.
Yes. Where did you live in the United States when you came here?
In New York, we first lived in Lower Bronx, Stebbins Avenue, a slum area. And my father, 5 of us in the family, 4 girls and myself. And my father was very nervous about the neighborhood, so we moved to Middle Bronx, about 180th Street, on the east side of the Bronx Zoo.
Then where did you go to school?
I went to Bronx High School of Science.
You did? Mm. That's a highly competitive school, isn't it?
Yeah, I learned that.
You learned that, huh?
When I was in elementary school, I did a lot of reading, but not the type of reading that students at science would have done. I read simple novels and short stories, adventure boy stories. And, I was behind in American history, so I read the Horatio Alger type stories about Abraham Lincoln, hard-working boy. And I graduated as the honor student, or was graduated from elementary school as the honor student without doing very much work. And so when I entered science, I automatically thought I was a genius. I found out that wasn't true at all.
That's an old story, isn't it?
It certainly is.
You didn't invent that story. When did you finish the Bronx High School of Science?
1960, June of 60.
And you're a junior now or a senior?
I'm a senior.
Senior now. What are you majoring in here?
Philosophy.
Yes, I didn't know that. What sort of reading have you been doing at Howard? What is your not your course reading, but your reading by choice?
Well,
what do you find most nourishing to you?
A lot of it have been in civil rights, magazines like The Nation, Dissent, etc., books by Du Bois, Fraser, McGill. I had to read articles by McGill.
Ralph McGill.
Yeah. Also, a fellow at Richmond Times, Richmond News, segregationist. What's his name?
Kirkland?
No, not Kirkland. Oh, I can't think of it.
Not Dabney?
No, not Dabney. I'm pretty sure he's connected with the Richmond Times. Oh well, maybe it'll come to me.
But you haven't, you have more or less confined your reading to matters directly bearing on the civil rights
well, I'm trying to
movement, is that it?
Well, I'm starting to taper off. I've been doing that, and also reading a lot of political readings, but I've started reading other things, like I read Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf just recently. I read your book last night because the one on segregation, the inner conflict. I started reading also previously a lot of white Southerners, We Dissent, William Smith, Ann Braden. But I want to taper off and read a lot of other things besides the civil rights, because
yes.
I find that I'm being dominated by the movement, my whole thinking and my whole life.
Have you read, for instance, Ralph Ellison's fiction?
Oh yeah, I read The Invisible Man about 4 years ago, 4 or It's a fantastic book.
It's a wonderful book, yes. It's a wonderful book. Have you read Faulkner's Sound and the Fury?
Yeah, I read Sound and Fury by Faulkner. I think the best thing I read by Faulkner, though, was The Beer. It's his little short story, I think.
Which one?
The Beer.
Yes, yes.
I think that's his best. But I haven't read all of his works, but I think that's the best I've read.
Sometimes it's said by Negroes that the character of Dilsey simply represents, you know, the Aunt Jemima type, slightly disguised, and this character is resented by some Negro critics. How do you feel about Dilsey?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't criticize Faulkner. It's my own feeling about Faulkner is that I like his style of writing. I think he's a good writer. I don't think that he was writing a story to win anybody, you know, in the South. He was just writing a story as he recalled it as a youth. Same thing with The Beer, you know. And that's how he saw it. I don't think you can blame him for that. He wasn't trying to say, I'm trying to show everybody there's something wrong with the South.
Well, Baldwin's attack on Faulkner would assume something quite different from both of those things, those possibilities. That he is entrapped by a certain Southern stereotypes about the Negro unconsciously, and that Dilsey represents a sort of libel, as it were, on the Negro.
Yeah, well, Baldwin wrote an attack, and I think that Baldwin's attack was a sort of a personal attack, even though he had to admit that, you're talking about the one that Nobody Knows My Name.
Yes, the attack on Faulkner, yes.
Yeah. He had to admit that, you know, and he even broadened the criticism, if I remember correctly, into the whole Southern way of life, that people who grew up in the South have to admit they lost the Civil War, yet they wanted as a country and a whole schizophrenic development. It seems to me his attack was on schizophrenia, that he had to admit that Faulkner was the same man who would write about Dilsey and still give his money, his Pulitzer Prize money, to the Negro Scholarship Fund.
But
am I getting it?
I was thinking Dilsey. Do you feel that this is an honest human rendering, or that it does partake of some concealed Southern stereotype?
Well, I think there's some Southern stereotype. I can't deny that.
Mm-hmm. In Dilsey?
Yeah, obviously, right.
Would that be a stereotype if such a person as Dilsey existed not uncommonly?
See, that's what I was hesitating about, because I think that such a person does exist.
Then he is drawing from life and is not creating a stereotype to just please himself in some unconscious way.
Yeah, well, that's what I started off by saying.
Yes.
He was just writing the facts as he saw it. If I were writing a story, you know, if I were depicting Dilsey, you know, I would do it probably the same way he did it, but then I'd go on a little further and say, well, I can understand Dilsey. Now, it might be that I would be rationalizing for Dilsey.
Well, Dilsey is made the moral center of the book, isn't she? She is the only person in the book who is totally human, who is in control of her fate in a moral sense, and who has compassion and understanding for others.
Well, this is the whole stereotype of the Negro maid. She's compassionate, she's understanding, her faith is...
Are we going now to the story of Ritual, Requiem for a Nun? You mean that?
Well, no, I haven't read that.
Well, you're just as well off, I think. It's one of his weakest books.
Yeah. I see, the trouble is that when you stand on an issue like that, there's just no middle ground. You have to take one side of the coin. I think that we ought to be careful about when we start criticizing people, that we're not just criticizing people because as Negroes, you know, we want to wipe out all that stereotype. See, I'm not sure I want to wipe it out.
Well, here's the point we're getting at then. I don't want to nag at this question, but it's an important question, I really feel. If given the whole context of life in which a Dilsey, or people like Dilsey, grew up, you have here a kind of great moral triumph. Out of various kinds of deprivations and oppressions, you have a character that morally and in all ways superior to anything around her. To the world, the white world around her is given by Faulkner as a decaying and corrupted world. She is the moral center, the moral focus of the book. Now, his intention certainly was to glorify her, to show her strength of character in the midst of people who are incomplete or weak or wicked. That seems to be the intention of the intention of the book, the picture he gives. Yet then how, it's very interesting to see that how this becomes taken as a libel on the Negro race.
Well, I think that it becomes a libel because people read into it what they want to read into it. They don't want to remember the Aunt Jemima type.
In other words, the fact of her being poor, oppressed, and loyal to certain white people.
Right.
That her loyalty to certain white people becomes a mark against her, then, is that it?
Well, in a sense, it becomes that way, especially since Faulkner is writing it. I think the fact that Faulkner is writing it has a lot to do with it. I think, for instance, if Baldwin had written that,
It would have been assumed Baldwin not being white and not being Southern.
right.
It would have been then a moral triumph for Dilsey to have pity for the idiot white boy Benji.
Right.
And Faulkner does it. It's not a moral triumph. It's a piece of obsequiousness and stupidity.
Absolutely. Yeah. Prime example. If you ever listen to Malcolm X very closely, Malcolm X
Beg pardon?
If you ever listen to Malcolm X carefully, Malcolm X says the exact same thing that all white people have been saying. Negroes are dirty, they should clean themselves up, they should stop drinking, they should stop smoking, they should stop cutting each other, they should go to church, get good jobs, and that's and clean up their neighborhoods. Now, if a white person were to get up and say it, he'd be attacked from here to God knows where. Now, Malcolm X can get up and say, well, we know why, it's because of white people, and get away with it. I think it has to do a lot with color.
In other words, now you are studying logic. This is a fallacy of the odd homonym, isn't it? Carried to the extreme, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's because I think that we all try to say to ourselves that, well, it doesn't really make a difference whether you're
back in business now. How did you first become involved in the civil rights movement? How did you enter SNCC, for instance?
Well, when I entered science,
This would be about 56?
Yeah, this was 56. I realized, how inadequate my whole intellectual background was. For example, I was attending school with students who knew so much about things that, I just vaguely heard about. I remember in my freshman year walking into a science class, I had a student who was same age with me explain Einstein's theory of relativity. And all I knew about Einstein was that he was some nut who used to go out in the sun with an umbrella. I remember having people talk about Marx and social studies and his dialectical materialism. And all I knew was that Marx was a dirty guy who was a communist. I remember making friends with a fellow called Gene Dennis, and finding out later and meeting his father. I thought his father was a brilliant, good-looking, charming fellow. Finding out later his father was chairman of the Communist Party and he was a communist.
This was a fellow student, you mean?
Yeah.
At Bronx.
Science, right. And things were all confusing to me. I didn't know. I thought that I wasn't supposed to hang around with communists. And here they were letting one come to school. Well, I began to realize that my parents had never finished high school. They'd never been to high school. We had no intellectual background. All these students' fathers had been to Harvard, Yale, all the Ivy League schools, had been doctors, dentists, PhDs. And they had the intellectual background which I didn't have, so I had to develop my own. Well, just beginning to read as quickly as I could anything that anyone would mention, and to develop my own intellectual background. Maybe it was naive at that time, but it was sincere in that I felt that I had to beat everybody at science. The fact that I was a Negro did stand out. Everybody was my best friend. I went through all the theories that everybody else went
How
through
is
a white
this?
school.
Let me interrupt. You said how many Negroes were in the school?
I think in my graduating class were only about 6 of us.
And how many? A couple of hundred students?
Well, let's see, there were about, no, I think registration was about 2,000 students, about 2,200 students. And out of that, I'd say we had about 50.
50 Negroes in the whole thing. Now you said everybody was your best friend. What did you mean by that?
Well, I was always being invited to parties. I remember...
You mean you were being invited because people were leaning over backward
Right.
to be nice to you because you were a Negro student in this school?
I remember, for instance, going to a party on Park Avenue. A friend of mine, I think he's at Yale now, invited me, and he kept asking me when I come to the party. I didn't care about going to the party, but he just kept on saying, won't you come, won't you come? I decided, well, I'll just go to the party and see what it's like. So I went to the party, and when I got there, I was very impressed with the place. It was doorman at the door, and the elevator went up and opened into the living room, sunken living room, open fireplace, stereo all over the house, rug, about that thick. I'd never seen this before in the movies. His mother came in during the party, and he insisted that everybody meet his mother. But more than that, he insisted that I meet his mother. I didn't really particularly care to meet his mother. I was so fascinated with the place. He was living on about the 15th floor, and I was looking out the window and just enjoying myself, just being there. But he insisted, so finally I thought I'd just appease him. Well, his mother had a group of other ladies, and then I was about the last one in. And when I got in, they all started saying, "Oh, I've heard so much about you. You've got such a good sense of humor. Jimmy always talks about you. Oh, you're such a good-looking boy. What features you have." And they just kept pouring it on and pouring it on. And finally, when I was leaving, the door was just about closed. His mother turned to the other ladies and said, "Oh, yes, we let Jimmy hang around with Negroes." I didn't like that.
Not very much.
I left the party. And it was a continual thing. Everybody would ask me on Friday night, "Whose party are you going to be at? We'll be there." "Oh, you can dance so well." "I can't dance." All the stereotypes were carried over, leaning backward.
Reversed.
Yeah, reversed. Everyone tell me how well I could sing. I can't carry a tune, And all the stereotypes with a good sense of humor you have, etc., etc.
Now, how much of this you think was mere fashion, merely chicness, and how much is some kind of honesty mixed up in it?
I think they were sincere without realizing it.
Without realizing what they were doing in their sincerity?
Yeah, I think they were sincere. They wanted to be my friend. They really wanted to be my friend. And of course, every time there was some racial conflict, I was always consulted as the spokesman, and whatever I said, I have great fun at this.
You mean they wanted to be your friend as, quotes, the Negro, but not your friend as Stokely Carmichael, is that it?
Well, I think there was a little of both mixed
Little
in.
of both.
Yeah, I think they
what
might...
you resented was being taken as a type,
Right.
as an example, rather than as a person.
Right. And I had great fun with this. I just went out to the NSA conference, and I would take the floor and just say any ridiculous thing, about Negroes, about the race conflict. Here were students from all over the country, and they would never attack me no matter what I said because I was a Negro. The whole thing has shifted so much that if you're a Negro and you're among a white group, by definition you're good, you're great, you're, That's not true, Negroes are bastards too, but I was good no matter what I did.
Yeah. Now, have you followed the controversy between Irving Howe and Ralph Ellison in dissent and the new leader in recent months?
No, I didn't see that. I just got a subscription to Dissent, the last 2 issues.
Well, this came out in the fall. The substance of it is this, similar to what you have been saying about yourself. I won't dwell on it now, but Irving Howe deplores the fact that as a novelist, Ralph Ellison has not pursued the protest line of Richard Wright and been the angry man, the violent protester against his life and his pain, his lot as Negro. Well, Ralph turns around and says, this is just like Bilbo. You're trying to stereotype me. I refuse the stereotype because life held something else for me, as well as the indignities that follow in the white man's world. And I intend to be an artist and not accept your stereotype. That's the...
Oh, I remember speaking with Baldwin, the fellow who did Pearl You're Victorious. This is bad, I don't know why.
Yes, I can't remember.
Jesse Davis and Killens. They were all saying that in order for them to write anything now, it has to be a protest. That publishers won't publish anything by Negroes unless they're writing protest books.
They published Ralph.
Well, Ralph Ellison, when that book was published, 1940?
No, 1952 or 3. 52, I guess, and they can't. He publishes wherever he wishes. He's greatly in demand. He hasn't finished his other book.
Well, that's the only book I've seen.
It will come out when it comes out.
Well, the only book he's written is Invisible Man.
Only book, yes. But the other book is parts appeared. But now, did you feel that The Invisible Man was a betrayal of Ralph's obligation as a Negro?
I did not. I thought it was a fantastic book. I thought it was a well-portrayed book of introspective feeling of Negroes. I think the whole development from the South to the North, the whole feeling of still being alienated wherever you go, I couldn't see it as being a betrayal. The involvement with the radical people he got involved with in the North, I think it's communists he was talking about. I don't see it as being a betrayal. He could have written something and have a bigger Thomas, but then I think he would be right if he wrote a bigger Thomas.
Ralph says in one of these replies to Irving Howe that no Negroes try to pressure him into writing protest novels, only white people.
It is probably true.
But this is the white stereotype. There's another one, a more fashionable one now, that is being imposed.
Yes, that's a mistake that Baldwin is going to make, you see. I think that the white press is going to demand that Baldwin keeps writing protest novels. And if he ever tries anything else, he'll just be dead. And you wonder how long can he go, how far can he go?
Do you see any difference in quality between Baldwin's polemical writing, his essays, and his fiction?
Yeah, he's an essayist. He's just excellent.
A great polemical writer, great essays.
Great essays. Funny, but I liked Giovanni's Room. Not very many people did.
I didn't, to be honest. I thought it was a great come down from his first novel.
Yeah, I liked it. Now, Go Tell on the Mountain was a fantastic work.
A really honest portrayal of
Right.
the boy growing up.
It's fantastic work. Flashback, had all the criteria of a good writer. But I still think that as an essayist, he's better.
I should agree with you. That's his way he's found himself. Let's go back to your involvement in the civil rights movement and your growth of awareness about the whole question behind that. You say when you went to the Bronx High School, you had these new friends, and you were pampered as the specimen Negro, the exhibit.
I was always told that I was going to be a brilliant Negro leader, and my parents wanted me to be a doctor, a good Negro doctor, etc., the regular stereotype. I didn't particularly want to be a doctor, but I never told them I didn't want to be a doctor. Just let them assume. While in science, I started to hang around with a lot of people on the left, young socialists, people in advance, ran in and out of Ben Davis's office, etc. Listened to what a lot of people had to say. I began doing a lot of reading on the left. I became aware of the fact, and I even believed that I could be groomed as a Negro leader. Maybe not a Booker T. Washington. And I'd heard about Du Bois at that point. Did a little bit of his reading. I thought that he made some mistakes. And I thought that I was going to be brilliant. I was going to study very hard. I was going to solve the race problem. In 1960, I picked up the newspaper and I read about Azelle Blair and his four companions. And my first reaction to this was, this is the wrong way of doing it. You know.
The sit-in.
Yeah, the sit-in. Threw the paper down. It's the New York Times.
Now, why this reaction?
Why? My first reaction was, well, actually what I said was, niggers are always looking to get themselves in the papers, no matter how they do it. You know. And my opinion was, they don't know what they're doing. And I'm quite convinced now that they didn't know what they were doing after I've met Ezell and spoke to them.
You mean they stumbled on
this? They didn't know what they were doing. About 3 weeks later, the New York Times had documented on the front page sit-ins that had spread all over the South. My reaction then was, niggers are just like monkeys, one do, all do. I threw the paper down again. About a month later, television interviews began to appear. I would hear students from A&I, students from Greensboro, South Carolina, who would split verbs and very distressed about this. If you want to run a revolution, you want to be intelligent. I still had conceived the idea that you have to have somebody in there saying, not just talking about emotionally, we've been treated bad, because I get tired of hearing that stuff all the time about how badly Negroes have been treated, etc. By about March, about April, mid-April, I thought that...
61.
60, it's still 60.
60, yes.
I thought, there were possibilities. Something could be done with this. In May of 1960, I was on some committee, some anti-HUAC committee. And they were having hearings on the Merchant Marines in Washington, D.C. Came down to D.C. As part of a protest group to listen to HUAC, and met a number of people who were then involved in sit-ins at Virginia.
And you're still in the high school now?
Right. I left the HUAC, went on a sitting in Virginia. Very impressed with the kids. They had what seemed to be courage. I had always been oriented from the left on an economic point of view. Sort of, not fully an economic determinist, but certainly great proclivity for that sort of thing. And realized that a lot of these kids weren't talking what I thought they would be talking about. They're just talking about, we have the right to sit here as human dignity. And, those are all.
You mean this as opposed to the economic approach?
Right.
You mean a human approach, a moral approach, as opposed to an economic approach?
It seemed to me that's euphemistic. It's always covered up. I think men always cover up their actions with moral issues. So I began thinking seriously about this whole problem. Whether or not it was an economic problem, or whether these students were right, whether nonviolence was really the thing, and love. I never took the approach of, we've got to teach them to love us. I thought that was nonsense from the beginning. I still do. But I was really impressed by the way they conducted themselves on the sit-in. The way they just sat there and took all the taunting.
You mean by their not just fortitude, but by self-discipline and their personal power,
right.
Inner power.
I was really impressed because when I lived down Lower Bronx, I learned, that you don't get tapped on the shoulder without turning around and swing. It was a rough neighborhood. And my aunt lived in Harlem, and I used to spend a lot of time down there with her. And got to know all the young fellows my age on the block. And it was always, see, I had internal conflicts too with this way of life and the things that I would thought.
In what sense you had the internal conflict?
Gang fighting, stealing cars, and when I moved up to the East Bronx, it was an all-Italian neighborhood bounded on one side by a Jewish neighborhood, Irish neighborhood. We're about the only Negroes in the neighborhood. And my father kept saying before we moved that we were moving to a good neighborhood. And when I first moved up to this good neighborhood, I had a fight about the first week. You know, everybody in the school heard that Negroes were tough, and they wanted to see how tough Negroes were. Then I had to do all the bad things to prove my point, you know, gang fight with everybody else. By the time I got to about the 8th grade, well, interesting happened. When I was in the 8th grade, and I knew all about marijuana and pot that I heard about from my cousin, etc. I'd never touched this stuff. In the 8th grade, some friend, well, acquaintance, guy in school, said that he had some and he wanted me to show him how to do it. Before I knew it, I had to put on a demonstration for about 30 people in the bathroom of how to blow up. I did it.
Now, who are these people?
These were all white Italian fellows.
Most of them?
Yeah.
Any other Negroes besides yourself?
No, I was the
only one?
Yeah, there were only 3 of us in the school. And I thought, now why did I do that? To prove a point. When I went into science in my freshman year, it was hard for me to adjust because even though I did that little gang fighting nonsense and always fighting with people, I always kept reading because my mother kept saying, you know, you must remember one thing, you know, those guys are white and you're a Negro, and they'll make it and you won't unless you're on top of them. Kept drumming into my head. And to get her off my back, I'd read. And as long as my grades were good, she didn't care what I did. I stayed out of trouble. When I got into science, I found out, you know, people didn't always fight each other. And, you know, they would swear and they were respectable and they read a lot of good books and they discussed all these things at the lunch table. Whereas in elementary school, we discussed who's the toughest guy, you know, they discuss who was the best writer, you know, like read the New York Times editorial, etc. It was hard conflict for me to adjust. At the same time, I was beginning to alienate myself from my old neighborhood. And by about the end of my freshman year, that summer I stayed in New York, the city, and hung around with all the fellows I used to hang around with, the gangs, and stole cars, gang fight and all that. Right in the middle of the summer, I kept thinking, you know, I'm going to get into real trouble if I keep this up. So I had to start alienating myself from them. And I started calling up people who, in science, whom I knew. I started to hang around with them more, you know, go swimming, play tennis. Of course, all my other friends would call me a fag. By about the middle of my sophomore year, I had completely broken all ties in my own neighborhood.
This raises a question as a kind of interruption. You know from Du Bois and from other writers the notion of the psychic split in the Negro, the division of self and loyalties. On one hand, the feeling of commitment to tradition, which is Negro, even to negritude and the black mystique and all of this, and a Negro culture as separate from, distinct from white Western European culture. On the other hand, the impulse to move into this the white society, to integrate with this society, accept its certainly to a large degree its values, even if they are criticized, and move into that society and perhaps be absorbed racially, biologically into that world later with actual loss of identity. Now, for some people, this is a real problem, a real problem, a spiritual depth. How do you, for others it's not. How do you feel about it? You were talking about a split of another kind.
Right.
Now, how do you feel about this?
Well, yeah, there was also the split with the Negro neighborhood. I was going to get to that.
Yes.
Because I developed certain loyalty ties in Harlem, because I used to go to parties down there. Same time, my mother and father constantly talking about the fact that you hang around with all these white kids. Where's your social life? They don't really accept you. So don't be fooled by them. Hold distrust. My father was a laborer, a carpenter, and he really got screwed around by the unions.
He couldn't go on a union?
Yeah, well, see, my father was a complex fellow. He was an honest Abe. He wouldn't steal, he wouldn't bribe, and he believed, very, very religious fellow, more religious than my mother, that God would always take care of everything. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I left the church, because of my father. He was in the union, and his union representative would never give him a job because he wouldn't bribe him. See, all the other fellows bribed him. Of course, he attributed this to the fact that he was Negro. Well, my mother and I called the union representative over. I was a freshman in high school, over the house, and we have a cousin who works on the SS America, and he asked him to pick up some perfume. My mother gave him some perfume and $50 for his wife. My father got a job and kept getting a steady job. My father never knew of this. Of course, he attributed this to God's goodwill, and then God will take care of it. But he'd always get screwed on the job in terms of being foreman and other little things, which a lot of them were justified, a lot of them were overemphasized, over-exaggerated. And so he had a complete distrust of white kids. He was always worried, white kids are coming down here. And then when I bring up my friends from Harlem, he was worried, can't you get any respectable Negro friends? I began thinking, why do I need respectable Negro friends? They thought they were moving into a white neighborhood, and those white kids taught me tricks that I never knew about breaking into stores, stealing cars. So I never knew that. Maybe it's because I was younger. I attribute that to younger. I guess had I stayed around the lower Bronx and down Harlem, I would have learned all these things. But they still had the conception that it was a good neighborhood because it didn't have all the things connected with the ghetto. We owned our own house. It was a shack, and my father was a carpenter, and he remodeled it, worked long, long hours. He was an industrious man. I sometimes wouldn't see my father for a whole week. He'd work his regular job, then he'd work an odd job, and then he'd drive a taxi at night. When things got rough in the winter, he became a merchant marine, and he'd go out on the sea. As long as he provided for his family, that was the important thing. All this was a conflict because he wanted me to be respectable like white kids. He didn't like me wearing dungarees. I wore dungarees all the time. He wanted me to, be very proper, speak, do the same thing that all the white kids were doing. I wasn't sure I wanted to do that. I used to hang down in the village, like everybody gets that young kid when I was about 16. We'll all go down to Greenwich Village because that's where everything is, that's what's happening. I used to see a complete reverse cycle of white kids jumping into Negro neighborhoods, becoming completely Negrotized, if we can use that word. Yeah, man, yeah, baby, let's get it, I'm hip, everything out of context, but just dropping words that come from the Negro neighborhood. And I always thought, well, this isn't right, and I wondered, wasn't I doing the same thing?
In crossing, in taking over a white world.
Right. Was not doing the same thing. And then that bothered me quite a bit because I didn't want to do that.
You felt some loss of integrity in doing that, you mean? Is that the idea?
Well, I wasn't sure if it was loss of integrity. Maybe there was some loss of integrity in there, as if it was loss of not being myself. I was always concerned about that.
You felt your identity was being betrayed somehow, is that it?
Yeah, like I would, Negroes and white teenagers dance entirely differently. And I would dance both ways. And I'd find myself at a party in Harlem, for instance, beginning to Lindy. Now, the Lindy is, when I was, I don't know if it's still around, was primarily a white dance, and Negroes would slop. And then everybody would start looking at me and say, man, you dance just like a white boy. And I'd stop, and I'd catch myself, and I'd say, yeah, I do. And I'd say, said, you hang around with them white people? And yeah, I hang around with white people. Man, you must be square, you don't know what's happening. Then I go to a white dance and I do a slop, and oh man, that's cool. That's real cool. Show me how to dance, And I thought, this was leaning over backwards here. And I wonder whether or not in Harlem they were completely fair when they said I was square for hanging around with white kids. So there was internal conflict. I resolved the problem by just going wherever I wanted to go. If I felt like going to Harlem, I'd go to Harlem. If I felt like going down the village, I'd do whatever I wanted to do. But there certainly was a loss and a cutting off of culture in the Negro neighborhood.
Let me make another excursion for a moment. Several people have told me, most notably Robert Moses, that when you have had students or people a little older coming in to help with, say, voter registration or other things, who are white or sometimes northern Negroes, real friction may develop and sometimes does develop. One of the objections is that the white boys coming in will try to assume attitudes, vocabulary, and stances that are Negro. And this is resented, or at least, if not resented deeply, becomes a matter of satire. Some contempt for the person who feels he can enter arbitrarily and take over another world. That's one of the points of friction, he said. Do you encounter that in the movement?
Quite a bit. Bob Zellner, I don't know if you spoke to him. You should. Bob Zellner from Alabama.
I haven't spoken to him, no.
There are a few other white people in the movement who have not what we call completely Negrotized. He's maintained, there's still a difference, you can tell it. And, people who come into the movement try to say that there is no difference. The other conflict is that northern whites, one of the reasons they do it, are all committed to equality on humanitarian levels and intellectual levels. And they themselves don't know Negroes. They don't even have Negroes in their own neighborhoods. They've never known a Negro. And they don't think that Negroes really think differently. When they come south and they find out there's an entirely different set of things, they jump into it right away to accept it.
They try to assume the culture without understanding what's behind it.
Right, and they say things and not realize what they're saying. Yeah, man, I really dig that, And dig can be used in two ways, sarcastically or good. And I found this a lot of times. They use words completely out of context in the Negro neighborhood without knowing it. They want to be accepted right away without being accepted for their worth.
Social climate.
Status seekers.
Status seekers.
They want to be accepted right away for their worth as a Negro, not as an individual, or their ability to assimilate into the culture to show, well, look, I'm not like the other whites, I dig your music, it's soulful. They would snap their fingers out of tune to music, to the music that's playing on the jukebox, and they talk about, I dig Ray Charles, and in Atlanta once a white fella came and started playing Ray Charles, and I was sitting with a couple of Negroes who hung around the barbecue shop, and he came by and said, man, Ray Charles is down. He's just so much. He's out of this world, man. He's like too much. And after he walked out, one Negro out loud to the whole barbecue shop, because he did this out loud so that everybody would know that he was there and, he's a good guy, said, that white boy don't even understand, because Ray Charles played like white boys can't even think, And everybody laughed. And it seems sort of true that Ray Charles plays music the way white people don't really think. And for him to come on just putting on a show is resented, as much as it would be resented if, I guess, I put on a show to show how white I was, how much I'd absorbed into the culture.
In other words, both ways is a question of some self-understanding and self-respect that's being violated. Is that it?
Yeah, I would think so, because I remember at one point I really, I think I was about a sophomore in high school, realized that I was really being ashamed of being a Negro. You know, and at one point, I was really ashamed of it. I had stopped saying things that I would say, you know, Negro neighborhood, and I was afraid of gospel music, which I'd always liked. And I remember thinking about that for about 2 weeks, you know. And I decided, you know, I'm going to go back to my gospel music and go back to the way I was.
How common do you think is the situation of the Negro accepting some derogatory white stereotype of himself, unconsciously or consciously?
Well, I think it's very, very common because whether or not Negroes won't admit it, they are 150% Americans. I think they accept Americans without even questioning it.
Including the white man's version of themselves.
Including that, I'm afraid, yeah, including that. When one becomes aware of it, it's a real problem because you're not sure how much truth there is to it. If you really want to be honest about it, now you have to admit that if you just walk through Harlem, it is about the dirtiest place that you've seen. There are always drunks on the street. People are always cutting each other. There are prostitutes on every corner. There are bars in every corner. You have to admit all this. Now then you may want to find reasons, and you want to be careful that you're not just rationalizing. Now you start off with the basic premise that Negroes aren't really inferior, and then you wonder whether or not have their conditions, you know, really been impressed upon them, or are they just, you know, are they really lazy? And this problem bothered me for a while too. You know. But you do accept it subconsciously.
Then there's the question of what is the escape? What is the solution of this acceptance of a version that defines the Negro as inferior? What is the solution, the psychological solution?
Well, for me, the psychological solution was to read as much as I could and to show, you know, like for instance, and maybe I even do it now. I think I still do it. I try to drop it. As soon as I meet a white student, you know, I want to prove to him that he isn't any smarter than I am, you know. That I do just as much reading, so, you know, if I'm aware of what's going on. And before we even get a chance to do anything, it's sort of what Baldwin talks about in Black Boy Meets White Boy. You play the game of cat and mouse. Let's see how much you know, and I'll show you how much I know, because I know you think that because I'm a Negro, I don't know very much, but I'm going to prove to you that that's not true. And so you see, subconsciously, you go completely on the reverse. You know, for instance, I even caught myself doing it early this September. I met a white boy from Yale, and kept, you know, playing this game of, how do you analyze the situation? And I caught myself saying, now what do I have to prove to him? Why am I doing it?
In other words, you're acting like the Yale boy who comes to Mississippi.
Yeah, quite in the reverse. Because see, it's so subconscious that unless we play with it and think about it constantly, we don't really become aware of it.
The old movies and the telephone rings.
You want to go back to the involvement?
Yes, go back to involvement. Your involvement in the civil rights movement. Go back to your high school days.
Well, I worked with the Youth March on Washington, my high school. That was really no problem because everybody thought it was a good thing and they would go. Now, I was vaguely aware of the problems that existed in New York. I became more aware of it as I took an economic look at the question. I used to hear a lot of people talk, and they'd say that when the revolution comes, and they'd throw that word around, it will come from the South first and then move up north.
The revolution being the Negro civil rights movement, or the revolution being something else?
Well, the revolution first starting with the Negro civil rights movement. See, one of the reasons why I began to distrust a lot of people on the left, it seemed to me that they were always jumping on this bandwagon, well, let's get the Negroes started, and they'll start it for us.
To pull the chestnuts out of the fire, you mean?
I really became very, very suspicious of this, because wherever I'd go, everyone would want to tell me how we should start the revolutions, how Negroes should do it. And then after they'd been, convinced that once we've got it started, they can do it, then they come and say, and then we can follow along with this, thus, and thus. And It seemed to me that they weren't really sincere about Negroes, that they were just trying to use Negroes to get something that I wasn't sure I wanted. And they all seemed to be convinced that they knew what they wanted. And if you asked them to define or outline a program in terms of it, they never knew. See? And neither do I. I don't know that in the long run anything is going to be solved. I think about that. I was arrested 2 years ago in New York on a demonstration.
A little louder, please.
Oh, I was arrested 2 years ago in New York on a demonstration at Bethel Hospital, trying to get Negroes to the unions to organize Negroes and Puerto Ricans. And while sitting around talking, some Negro who'd been working there for quite a while said he remembered when they had a big stink about getting Negroes hired. I thought what a vicious cycle this was. 15 years ago they fight and get hired, a couple of years ago. Now here they are having a vicious fight just to get higher wages. Where does it all end? When does it end? And that started me thinking, well, am I really going to get anything solved? What am I doing? Why am I in this fight? What is it going to prove? What am I going to get out of it? Do I know what I want out of it? Funny, but when I read that line in your book about that segregationist who said, well, I don't know why I'm doing it, but I guess I've got to do it. I sort of thought last night, what is Mr. Warren going to ask me tomorrow? And am I really like this guy? I just feel that I have to do it. When I first came back from Mississippi Freedom Rides, I had everybody on my back calling me, asking me why. The question was why? And people from all over the country, and I couldn't answer why, and I still can't answer why.
You felt a compulsion which you couldn't analyze.
Yeah,
to join the Freedom Ride.
Well, from if we go back to 1960,
let's go back. Yes, go back.
After that demonstration, I became very impressed with these people that I had seen, and they were Southern students, and really were out there. Now, it seemed to me that they wanted restaurants
like
integrated.
Mr. Blair and people like that.
Right, Blair, Dion Diamond, Hank Thomas. They wanted restaurants integrated, and they were willing to pay the price for it. Now, I didn't think that was too important, but I thought, well, you got to start somewhere. At that point, I had thought that, along with Tom Kahn in his Unfinished Revolution, that the labor unions are going to come in ultimately and help really get the problem going. I'd done a little bit of reading on the Populist Party, and I thought that this would solve a lot of the things. I'm not too sure about that now. Excuse me. Well, during that summer, I'd take frequent trips back down to Washington on weekends and work with the people in Virginia. It's one of the deciding factors that made me decide to come to Howard University. See, I wasn't sure I wanted to go to Howard University. Didn't want to come to an all-Negro school. I wanted to go to a school where I thought I'd get a good education. And I wasn't sure that Howard University could afford to give them a good education. Yeah, I'm sorry. And so I did decide to come to Howard University. And one of the deciding factors was the fact that I could work in the movement while I was here. Well, all year I worked with the movement around Virginia, sitting in, etc. In the December of 1960, I went to Fayette County in Tennessee, took a ride down. I was very impressed with the people down there. It seemed to me they were really doing something on this issue of the vote.
You mean the Negro workers there?
Intensity. One of the things that really impressed me was that while I was there, I spent about 4 days. I was always cold, hungry, freezing, and miserable. The ground was hard. When it was hard, it was muddy, ankle deep, and it was firewood, and kids would go out and chop firewood and come back contented, and they sit around and sing songs in the evening. Very, very moving thing. I thought, this is way more important than a restaurant. The power to vote. I came back, and we still worked along with the sit-in movement. I kept thinking, now, if I don't believe in this as much as I think I am, what am I doing? And I came to consideration, well, you've got to motivate people on some issue. You've got to motivate them on an issue that they can see clearly. Now, they can see this clearly, and then after they see this, then maybe you can move on. Then came the Freedom Rides, and I packed up and left. After that, I just stayed in the South.
Was that in the first Freedom Ride?
Yeah, it was the first Freedom Ride.
What were your experiences on that ride? I mean, your internal experiences as well as your external experiences. The event and feeling both.
Now, well, From
Just
Harlem.
try to tell me, will you?
From Harlem, I knew that people could hate pretty viciously, and I'd seen what people could do to people. From my neighborhoods, I'd see how 5 guys could jump on somebody and beat them up. I was sometimes a victim of that. And I realized that, for instance, we used to have a constant gang war with people across the bridge, the kids across the bridge. I don't know what they call themselves, the Parkchester boys or something like that. And we were the Morris Park Avenue Dukes. And if the Morris Park Avenue Dukes saw a Parkchester boy, you just had to hit him, I thought that was kid stuff. I saw a lot of vicious things that people would do to each other. So I was aware of what people could do to each other. But this whole thing about, for instance, in Fayette County, they tell about how they were being shot at, etc.
This is around Jackson, Tennessee, you mean? Is that the place?
Yeah, Jackson was the place, but we first went into New Orleans. We're going to come
Jackson,
into New
Tennessee,
Orleans.
man, we're talking about.
Yeah, this Fayette County. Now, I thought when I was going, this is really serious, and somebody may really die. And I thought, now, do I really want to put myself in a position where I can die? And do I think that if I do die, that something will be solved? Well, I got rid of that very easy by saying, yes, somebody will die, but it won't be me. It'll be the guy next to me. And that was all there was to that. So the next question was, why was I going? Well, I was supposed to go on the first bus that left, the bus that was burnt, but I had about a week and a half left of school, and I thought, well, it's silly to leave school now. I'll just come south after I'm finished with school. When the bus was burned and everybody was beaten, everybody on the bus I'd known very well, I'd worked with, I was very upset. And I thought, now you just can't go off just because somebody got beaten, or just because the bus was burned. What's that going to prove? Our decision was, well, I have to go because if they're in jail and we're buddies, that they need friends, and if at least I can do is keep them company. I thought, well, that's pretty weak. I thought, well, I have to go because you've got to keep the issue alive, and you've got to show the Southerners that you're not going to be scared off as we've been scared off in the past. And no matter what they do, we're still going to keep coming back. And perhaps that was the deciding factor. When we got into New Orleans, it was about 3 o'clock in the morning. And I had never seen a mob stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning. But they were there at the airport, and people just yelling and screaming and spitting and throwing cigarette butts and what have you. And my first reaction was, wow, I sure hope those policemen keep them under control, because I don't know what I would do. I'd been in violent situations in Virginia, but I just thought, this isn't Virginia, this is Louisiana. Well, we got in the car and drove away. Next morning we went to the train station. We were all arrested. I didn't know for what.
You see, you got off the plane and then drove from the plane to
to
How
the
did the mob know you were arriving by air?
That I don't know. I don't know that. Maybe someone had announced it. I was very worried about that because it was 3 o'clock in the morning and they were still there. Maybe they notified the police. I think what Core might have done, they probably notified the police for protection, and somehow it got out. Well, anyway, we had a police escort for a while, and then when we were pretty sure no one was following us, we went to the outskirts of town and stayed in some project. When we got up the next morning, went to the train station, got arrested. I don't remember what for. We were released about 45 minutes later. I kept remembering the face of the chief who kept saying, "You're not going to change anything. You're not going to change anything. And we'll just keep throwing you in jail. We'll beat you up. And furthermore..." He said this. Yeah. And furthermore, those people are going to end up killing you. You're not going to change anything. You're not going to change anything. Then we were released, and we're getting on the train to go to Mississippi. There were mobs all over, and I've never seen people. For the first time in my life, I really got scared of people. Just had all sorts of faces. And one thing was an old lady in particular who was about 70 years old, shaking her cane viciously, just trembling all over at me. And I just kept looking at her, not because I wanted to antagonize her, because I really couldn't believe this. We got on the train, and wherever we stopped, there were policemen with pump rifles keeping mobs back. And I kept thinking, Why? Why is there such aroused? Why are they so aroused? What is it? Of course, when we got into Jackson, the police were waiting in the waiting room and not outside. So before we got outside, we had quite a scuffle to get through the mob. And people were just saying, "I'll kill you." And for once, I really believe that they meant it. People have said to me they'd kill me before, and I never took it seriously. But somehow I thought that these people meant it. And I wondered whether or not I really believed they meant it, or whether I was scared because I was in the South and heard so many stories about it.
This is the end of tape 1 by Stokely Carmichael, Washington, D.C., March 4. See tape 2. This is tape 2 of the conversation with Stokely Carmichael. Continue. Where were we? Oh, you were talking about going to Jackson, Mississippi, on the Freedom Ride.
A long walk into the waiting room. We faced a mob, and I was trying to look at people's faces. Meantime, trying to hold my suitcase up so I wouldn't get cigarette butts. They were flicking cigarette butts at us. And I kept thinking, why? Why? It's a naive question, but it's something that still comes back because you still can't find the answer. When you try to find the answer for questions that bother you, it's really a problem. Am I really, irritating people? And would it be best if I didn't really come? Will things really work out? Is it really my business, etc., etc.? And all these questions were flashing through my mind. We got arrested, though. I got to know the jailer. See, everybody in jail preaches and very religious. I'm not. And they were praying all the time, singing. I'd sing, I wouldn't pray. I'd sit and read. We spent about a week in the Jackson City Jail before we moved to Parchment. Before we were moved, the night before, we found out that we were being moved from the prisoners below, who they were Negro prisoners below, so they thought we were great, heroes, etc. And they told us everything we needed to know. Excuse me. Yes, ma'am.
You were saying you were in the jail waiting to be moved to Parchment.
Right. Now, the jailer came up and he held the bars, and see, we got to know each other fairly well. I mean, us as a group, and he's an individual.
What kind of man was he?
He was an old man, about his early 50s, I'd say. Believed in the Southern way of life, whatever connotation it brought to him. But he was an honest man, and he thought at first that we were just a bunch of troublemakers, agitators, and we were just coming down to cause trouble. We were communists, etc., etc. And that he was going to rule with a ruthless hand, and that we were going to do as he said. He found out that we wouldn't do as he said. No matter what he did to us, we'd still keep singing when he would say not to sing. So after a while, it became a little petty game. He'd do certain tricks to try and keep us in line. Like there'd be soup for a meal one day, and it'll be hot, and there were about, I can't remember how many, but let's say there were about 30 of us in there. He would pass 30 hot bowls of soup with about 3 spoons, and then say, I don't have any more, pass it around. So if you were last online, you just had cold soup. All these simple little things. But he found out that we wouldn't break under those little things. And it got so as, he'd even joke a little and laugh, and he'd say, you're going to be here for a long time. And we'd say, yeah, but you got to be here with us, don't forget that. I think, I hate to use euphemisms, but I think we got to respect each other. Anyway, I got to respect him. After a while, the respect grew. And we got to respect each other very well, sort of. It grew because I respected him as a man, you know, and began to forget that he was a white Southerner, that he was my tailor. Well, it came that we can really talk, you know, about issues, and he told us about what we didn't understand about the Southern way of life. Of course, he'd say the same stereotypes that Negroes were treated well, etc., and everybody would answer him with saying, well, that's not true, you know, Negroes aren't really treated well, that's bad, etc., etc. We finally came to some understanding, I guess a sort of unspoken understanding, that we won't mention, you know, our radical points of views to him, we'll just talk about other things. And I found out a lot through him about Mississippi and the way of life, you know, that he used to go fishing with Negroes, etc., etc., and he thought it was on equal footing. I didn't think it was on equal footing. I don't know, it might have been. That's something that bothered me. Well, anyway, the night we were leaving, or the day before we were leaving, he came to the bars and he held on to them very, very tightly. You know, and all of a sudden he started talking about his life. He started talking about his maid. I can't remember her name. Let's call her Annie in stereotype. He said, Annie was good. She brought up and raised all my 5 kids, and we loved Annie dearly. It was a sort of deep, introspective thing about when Annie died, the whole family cried. They went to Annie's funeral, and every year he places a wreath on Annie's grave. And he wanted us to understand that we were all wrong about race relations in the South, that they were really very good, and they were going to be better, you know, and the Negroes really liked it that way. But he was shaking. You can visibly see him shaking, and that, you know, we had our points of view as far as he was concerned, and he had his. He didn't want us to try and change him. He was going to keep to his way of life. He believed in God, and he believed in the way of the life of the South. He believed in human beings for what they were worth. He started crying. A tear dropped. And finally he said, I want you to know that whatever happened to you, you know, that you caused me a lot of trouble. That I can't go along with the trouble you caused me, but you're still human beings, and you have your beliefs and I have mine. And he left. I thought about that for a long time. Everybody else thought, you know, he's just, you know, putting on a show.
I doubt it. I doubt it.
I doubt it. I don't think he was putting on a show. He didn't have to.
Let me tell you something briefly that Mr. Evers said in such a conversation as this. I asked him about the future of Mississippi, and he said, well, I think we can work it out. Otherwise I wouldn't stay here. For one thing, these Mississippians, said the bullies and, you know, cowards everywhere, but said they are raised by and large on some notion of respect for courage. This is part of the code they are raised on. And when they see that we have courage to stand up on a point we believe in, they begin to respect that. As this respect is a basis for something that we can build on. They can respect that in us, and the things that we can respect. And though we may be against each other to the shooting point, there's a mutual respect possible. Second, he said, once this white segregationist crosses a line in himself and starts to deal with you, he won't lie to you. He said, he's crossed the line already. And he went on to say, he's not like, he said, the fella up north who will slap you on the back and say, that's fine, I'm with you. So he won't lie. So we have some basis for hope. Otherwise, I would leave the state, he said.
Well,
does that make any sense to you?
Well, I think the courage part makes sense, because my feeling is that people in the South are entirely different. They still have a sort of, you know, wild way of life. There are certain things that are dear to them. There are certain things that are dear to them. No, I never thought about the courage part as Charlie developed it, but I think there's something to be said for that.
For what it's worth, this is what he put on the tape. Let's go back to your narrative. We've left the jailer now.
Yeah, well,
taking to the bars.
Now, I wanted to speak to him. He left. I wanted to ask him, what is he trying to say? Because I knew he was trying to say something. And I knew that he knew that we were leaving. I don't know if he wanted to say we were leaving. He did say it because he said, no matter what happens to you, I want you to know that, you have your way of life and I have mine. And before he left, he turned around and he said, I don't know what's going to happen. He said, but I want you to know I want my children to have happiness and my grandchildren to have happiness. He said, I'm sure you all want the same for y'all kids. And he left. The next night we were moved out. And I didn't see him after that at all. We went to Parchment. And we had, at first, they told us, we had a big drill session early in the morning. That you're at Parchment, and you're going to do as we say, the same thing. I saw the same sort of breakdown with the little fellow we used to call Sarge, and the fellow called Sheriff Tyson. Sheriff Tyson once took our mattress away, and I thought it was unfair, so I told him I protested, and he said that he'd start with taking me first. So I told him he'd have to drag me out the cell, the mattress, and everything else. So he said he would do it. He said he'd do it by himself. He wouldn't get anybody to help him. So he opened up the door and started dragging me out. Well, he dragged me out in the hall and took the mattress away. And he said, now get back in the cell. I told him that I couldn't do that. I'd have to resist him non-violently. He'd have to get me back in the cell. So he said he's not even going to drag me. He got something that'll take care of me. So he got some wrist breakers, put it on my arms. Those things really hurt, man. And he started twisting, and I just kept looking him straight in the face. He kept twisting and twisting and twisting. And he said, if you ain't the damn dog as hardest nigga I ever met. He said, you gonna get in that cell? I said, no, I can't do that, Sheriff Tyson. I said, I think you're unfair. And all of a sudden he stopped. He said, unfair? He said, you mean to tell me you think I'm unfair? And he started an indictment against me of things. He said, now how could you say you're unfair? You sing when I ask you not to sing. You pray when I ask you not to pray. You make noise when I ask you not to make noise. You just think you're going to run my jail. I can't let you do that. Now who's unfair? And I thought for a minute, he really believed in fairness. And from his point of view, I was being unfair. And from my point of view, he was being unfair. So he said, now you say I'm unfair. He said, now you won't get back in the cell because I tell you, John, you're a prisoner. You're a prisoner. No. I said, yeah, but I want to be treated fairly because I was a prisoner. See, I was finding myself for once on the defensive, and I thought, damn, I'm letting this stupid southern sheriff put me on the defensive. And so finally he called the trustee. He said, put that boy in the cell. And after he put me in the cell, I came back about an hour later. He was also visibly shaken. And he said, I don't think you were right to call me unfair. And for once, I forgot he was a Southern sheriff. Like if we were discussing in a philosophy class the concept of fairness and justice, and he made an indictment against things that he'd asked us not to do and we'd done. And I answered him by saying, yeah, well, I think you were unfair in taking our mattress because, we have the right to pray. You don't let us have any ministers. We don't see our lawyers. You took away our clothes. You took this away without giving us reason. He said, well, nobody asked you to come down here. I said, well, that's right. I've come down here, and I'm going to accept the consequences, but I'm not going to accept them without putting up some resistance. And he said, well, that's always the trouble. People always got a reason. Well, you go on, because I have to resist too. And I wanted to ask him why. I've always wanted to ask him, why did he feel he had to resist? And before I could ask him, he walked away. Then I thought, well, why did I have to resist? And he walked away. We got to be sort of good friends, too, in a funny way. I spent about 49 days up there, and every time trouble started, he'd automatically come to me. And he'd say, now, this is what we're going to give you, this, and this, and this is what we want from you. It got to the point where we can really, it became a treaty. We're going to give you this, we're going to give you that, you give us this, and you give us that. He'd always resort to his last tactics when he thought that we were being, we wouldn't listen to him. And one tactic he resorted to was throwing people in the hole. He did this once.
Solitary
confinement, yeah. And he threw Hank Thompson in the hole, who was in the cell next to me. And I started shaking the bars, because Hank was, I can't remember what it was, some protest or something. And I called him back, and he said, now what you want? I said, Sheriff, you threw Hank in the cell, in the hole. He said, yeah, and he's going to stay there. And I said, Sheriff, you got to put me in the hole too. he couldn't understand. He said, "No, what's wrong with you? I haven't done anything to you." I said, "Now that's between me and that boy down there." I said, "Yeah, but see, I think you were unfair, Sheriff." He said, "Well, if I'm unfair, it's between me and him." I said, "No, Sheriff, you're wrong. It's not between you and him. It's between you and everybody else in the world." And so he said, "You really mean you want to go to the hole?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Open up the door." When he opened up the door, everybody else banged on the door and said, "We all got to go to the hole." He couldn't believe this, so he packed everybody in the hole. It's a good thing he let us out, because I don't really think we could have taken it. We could hardly breathe. He wasn't putting water. When we came out, everybody was getting back to the cell. He said, "I think you're crazy." And I looked at him and smiled, and I said, No, Sheriff, you don't think I'm crazy. You think I'm too smart for you." He said, "No, you're not smart. You're not smart. You're really ignorant." And then we went on to have a couple of conversations that didn't amount to very much. Except that one time, when I was leaving, he took the pleasure of getting me out. And he called my name last, and he opened up the cell door. And he said, "I'm glad to see you go." He said, "Are you glad to be going?" And I said, "No, I'm going to miss you, Sheriff." He said, "Well, I'm going to miss you too, all the trouble you caused me." And I said, "Well, I'll probably be back, Sheriff." And he said, "I'm not going anywhere. I'll still be here." And the Sarge says, in a very sad voice, "I wish y'all would just leave everything alone." And Sheriff Tyson sort of nodded. And I wanted to say, "Well, I can't do that," but I didn't. I just walked out. But that was the only confrontation I had with white Southerners. It was the only time that I really got to see that outside of a mob alone, they were just like, we were outside of a mob. I can go on a freedom ride, when there are people around me, I'll say, "Oh yes, nothing is going to happen to us." When you get alone, when you sing on that stool by yourself and somebody's behind you, and you hear a knife clicking and hot coffee being poured down people's back, 1 minute you're isolated and you're alone, and you really begin to feel, why am I here? When is it going to end? It was just before that first punch is thrown, just before you get hit, that little period there, just before when tensions are built, and you can't control your stomach because it keeps jumping, and you start thinking over and over again. I think, maybe that's the way it is when you're really alone. When you really want to sit down and talk to people, when you really got to say, let's just sit down and talk this out, Sheriff Tyson, just me and you, and let's see, where we're going. And you say, "Well, you can't do it." You always wonder why. Why can't I sit down and talk to Sheriff Tyson? Why can't Charlie ever sit down and talk, Medgar ever sit down and talk to Love Beckwood? You always wonder why. Go back to that. Well, after I got out of jail, I went to New York City for about 2 weeks, and my father and mother told me, "This is it. You're finished. You've done your part. End it. Forget it." A week later, I found myself in Nashville, Tennessee, and started voter registration at the end of the summer and went into Mississippi with Macomb County Liberty voter registration program. And from then on, it's just been...
That's where Allen was just lately killed.
Right. And from then on, it's just been... Now, there have been other developments. Yeah, there have been other developments since just the southern part. There have been other developments in that I, began to find out that a lot of people who were just talking about civil rights were jumping on a bandwagon. And that's
who had been just talking about it, or who had now...
No, who had been talking about it and who are now talking about it too,
But not acting, you mean?
Well, even if they're acting, see, one of the things that bothers me is that I'm all for demonstrations, but I think that people are beginning to have radical demonstrations or radical action without radical thought, see. Like you question the proposal of busing people back and forth to Harlem.
Yes.
And you say, well, if I speak out against that, Negroes will think that I'm betraying them. You say, but I don't honestly believe it. And if
in the busing system.
Yeah. And if some white person, if a white press would say to you, well, what's your opinion? What would you say? We say to them, well, you can't say yes because it's really nonsensical.
I was going to ask you about it.
That's a question that's been bothering me. You can't say, well, it's nonsensical. And you're going to say to them, these Negroes don't know what they're talking about, because so many Negroes are behind it. Well, I'll tell you, I'm against it. I think it's silly. I think it doesn't solve the problem. because in about 10, 15 years, most of New York City will be, all Negroes. And what are you going to do? Bus kids in from Poughkeepsie? It's not going to solve the problem.
Washington, D.C., you'd have to go to West Virginia now to get to balancing.
That's nonsense.
Some Negroes, of course, say that it's merely a matter of a tactical device to dramatize the situation.
Yeah, but it's not solving any issues. It's not solving the issues. And if you're going to dramatize, I'm all for dramatizing issues. But you're going to dramatize them because you dramatize issues because you hope they're going to be solved. I don't think you dramatize issues just to dramatize issues.
There are two separate issues in this matter of New York, one being the quality of the schools.
Now, that would be a good issue.
But that's clear that they are inferior schools. There's no question about that.
I agree with that because I worked in Harlem and I know the schools. Right now, I would agree if they would say, no, the schools, you send the poorest teachers, the schools are run down, etc., etc. Now, I'll agree to all that. If you're going to dramatize it and ask for those issues. But now, when you bring in the question of busing kids, it seems to me you're being unfair because I think, let's face it, Harlem is no picnic ground. I don't think that Harlem is a place for race riot because one thing that Dick Gregory does say that's very funny but very true is that you don't have a race riot, you don't have a bad neighborhood or a neighborhood that's because black people are living there, white folks come in that they get beat up. It's not a bad neighborhood just because white folks get beat up. Because Negroes get beat up in the neighborhood too. Negroes get beat up in Harlem all the time. So just because you're white and you get beat up doesn't mean that all the Negroes are beating up white people. It's a bad neighborhood, let's face it, for whatever conditions that are, whatever produced it is. And you can't really and truly ask somebody to send their kid in there.
There's another argument on this side, on the side of the busing that I've heard, given by Negroes. All right, we suffer. We want the white man to suffer some too.
That's nonsense.
And if he had to send his children 2 hours a day on the bus, he should just share the suffering. He should spread the suffering around at even the expense of a 10-year-old child that is being bused 2 hours a day out of his life.
That's nonsense. That's clearly nonsense. You can't, I think that whole goes through suffering comes redemption, and I don't believe in that. I don't think anybody has to suffer.
Well, this is vengeful suffering too. We're
right.
saying let's pass some to the white man, make his children too, about being hauled around.
See, that's the problem when people jump on a bandwagon. And the funniest thing is to watch the rise of the Muslims in America. Now, Muslims, when I used to go in Harlem, used to stand on a corner on a step ladder and yell and scream the same nonsense they're yelling and screaming now. See Eric Lincoln, whom I don't think is a very intelligent man, or even a competent research. That other book, Black Nationalism by
Udam.
Yeah, Udam is a way better book than his black Muslims ever been.
Much more thoughtful book.
Yeah, it's a competent book. I read his book in 1960. He came to Nashville to speak to us. This man is ignorant. Now, he wrote the book, and the white press read the book. Somebody got scared, and they said, wow, we're not even aware of this. And they started writing in the white press. Dick Gregory says something else that's very funny. Malcolm X never knew that he had 200,000 followers until the New York Times told him so. The Muslims got respectable. They got off the step ladder. They put on ties and jackets, and they became famous. Everybody's afraid to say that the Muslims are full of beans. Nobody says it. Muslims are full of beans. They're never going to get a separate state. That's nonsense. They're switching one God for the other God. They're talking about Allah. And everything they talk is they present no solution to the problem. All of a sudden, Malcolm X began to be invited to speak on all issues on the thing. Now, I went to hear Malcolm X. I know Malcolm personally. And I tell him, you talk. You keep your talk on your side. You can say what you want. I don't even think that you put me in a better bargaining position at all. Because you don't say anything. He doesn't say anything. Everybody's afraid to attack him. The funniest thing I read was an article by Loren Miller on the West Coast, a fellow for vice president of the NAACP, wrote an article in The Nation about 2 years ago called A Farewell to White Liberals, which was a ridiculous article. He got pepped up with this black nationalism and said, goodbye, white liberals, we don't need you, you don't do anything for us. Clear logic shows the article to be ridiculous. And everybody started, the NAACP put out print, reprinted it, and passed it all over the country. And it's clearly ridiculous. When they were attacked by Malcolm X, instead of standing on the ground, they folded and absolved and said, we're friends. People just jump on bandwagons. That's one of the things you've got to be worried about. See, once the movement becomes accepted, then you've got to worry, because people don't really look for real solutions anymore.
Well, there are a variety of types of leadership clearly in this, and different competing groups.
No.
That's only natural, I suppose. But what is your diagnosis of this division of leadership and division of policy? How serious is this as a danger to the movement?
I think it'll become more serious. I was in Cambridge in Princess Anne this weekend, and Gloria just got that food surplus thing to come in. And while I was at the house, about 5 white people called anonymously, and they said, you know, I don't play your racial stuff. In essence, they said, you know, I'm not for it, but I'm real glad that you got this surplus food, because see, surplus food is going to be distributed on an integrated basis. They said, we've been needing this for a long time. And Gloria would inevitably say to them, well, would you speak out? And they'd say, well, I can't, you know, my husband, etc. But it proved one thing. It does prove that people are beginning to see beyond all of this nonsense, beyond this thing. They're really getting at what I consider real issues. You know, for instance, the Eastern Shore is dastardly poor. The Eastern Shore is dastardly poor. And if white people can really come out and say to Gloria, yeah, we're with you on this issue, it may mean there's breaking ground for more issues. And all the people who are splitting, for instance, what's that guy, Cecil Moore from Philadelphia? What is all this Klan nonsense about? But what is it going to solve in the long run? You wonder, you know, if people are really opportunistic, you know, and that's something that bothers, I think, a lot of people if they're honest about the movement, you know. Like, you wonder, you know.
Do you know the Reverend Galamison, is that the way you pronounce it?
In Galamison from Brooklyn?
Yes.
Yeah, I know him.
You know him personally?
Yeah, I've met him once. I don't think he's very intelligent either. See, if you're really serious about it, it seems to me you've got to think about whether or not you're opportunistic. See, it bothers me a lot. See, if I see my name in the paper, I'm not sorry it's there. You know, when Robert Penn Warren writes me and says he wants to interview me, I'm not sorry that he wants to interview me. I sort of feel good, and you got to wonder, well, which comes first? You know, the seeing or that? You got to take that seriously. Because you find yourself saying a lot of things that maybe you wonder, you know, that isn't really true. You're just saying that because people want to hear it. And you don't want to do that if you're really looking to solve the issues. One of the reasons why I respect Bob is because he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He says what he believes, you know, right or wrong, accepted or unaccepted, not right or wrong. Accepted or unaccepted, he's going to say what he believes.
He doesn't close up the official front, as it were. He will stay to his own position without worrying about the tactics of it or the consequences of it.
That's one of the things that we have to be worried about. And the trouble is that you get an opportunist and he becomes a rhetorician. He says things that are going to appease people. He's not going to really look for solutions. Now, everybody's all hepped up about this busing thing in New York. It isn't going to solve anything. What is it going to solve? I want to know.
Do you think it's just a test of power on an issue that is meaningless as an issue?
I wonder if it's not just some people really are beginning to feel that, you know, Negroes are really united. Let's get on there, you know. You wonder what are the political connections behind everything.
Sure.
I always wonder about that. I no longer accept.
Now you're talking about the Negroes joining up or whites joining up?
I'm talking about Negroes.
It works for whites too, joining up with
does.
the civil rights movement
It
because
does.
it has a kind of fashion or a kind of winning team element.
It certainly does. There's no doubt about it. You know, you're very suspicious about white people in the movement. You always wonder why. You know, why is he here? But then it really bothers you when you start getting suspicious about Negroes. And that's been developing more and more. You know, I get very afraid when I read the name of one person over and over again who's saying nothing, essentially nothing, who's got the press following him around and saying essentially nothing. You worry whether or not they ever read anything. You know, I've heard people get up and talk about the Civil Rights Bill, and they've never read the Civil Rights Bill. You know, now how can you do that? How can you do that? Or they'll get up and give their opinion about what's going on in Mississippi, and they've never been there. And it all runs back to the same thing, is those dirty old white people, you know, dirty old white people. If they just give us our equality and our freedom, you know. The funniest thing is ask somebody what they mean by freedom now, you know.
Well, that's one of the questions one asks always, what is meant by freedom now.
Ask them, what is freedom now? You know, we want it now, all of it. What do you want? The other most nonsensical thing I've ever heard in my life is preferential treatment for Negroes.
In what sense would you argue that?
Well, in sense number one, it doesn't solve any problem because you're not going to get the government to give you preferential treatment. Number two, that the Negroes who are getting preferential treatment are Negroes who don't need it. Who? IBM are going to give Negroes preferential treatment? They're not going to hire Negroes. They're going to hire Negroes who are competent. They have to. Who's going to get preferential treatment? Is the laborer in the street going to get preferential treatment? Is the person on welfare get preferential treatment? How are you going to do it? Can you get the government to put through a mass preferential treatment? The answer is clearly no.
I have talked with a president of an insurance company, a white insurance company in the South, who volunteered this to me. He said, I'm swinging to the policy of preferential treatment for Negroes. He said, I think we have to do this to take up some slack, give special training, and if it's a choice, take the Negro, as a matter of social tactics. He said, to take up the slack, we have to do this. This is a man in a very high position in business, you see.
Now, is he afraid that his business might be boycotted?
No, he's not.
No
He said, he's saying this is a policy. He's not advertising the policy. But he said, this is a policy I believe in as a matter of social good. He said, I think it's a matter of general social good to give preferential treatment when possible.
Now, see, on a broad basis, that could never work. Because what you'll be doing on a broad basis is putting white people out of jobs.
Yeah, sure. And it becomes another problem.
That's what it ultimately leads back to. Now, how do you get out of that hole?
As I was sitting in a cafe in Cambridge the day before yesterday, 3 or 4 white men, 2 of them unemployed, talking along the counter. And one said, I haven't worked in 6 weeks or 8 weeks, whatever it was. And the other said, I know why, your face is not black.
So, you know, that's what it's doing.
That's the... Whether it's true or not there, I'm sure it's not true. But the point is, this is the talk at the lunch counter.
Now, when they backed up into that corner, it seems to me, the only thing left for them to say, and what they have been saying, which I don't agree with, is that, well, you see, the reason why we need this is because we've been so long oppressed, you know.
It's back pay, you mean?
Yeah, back pay, you know, pay on dues. You know, you owe us this, and it's a drip right down from the Muslims. You know, you owe us dues. I don't know that anybody owes me anything. You know, I can't hold you guilty, and I don't want you to hold me guilty for what my father did. I don't believe in the Bible that the guilt of the father is going to follow the children.
Consequences do follow the children.
They certainly do.
It's not guilt, it's consequences.
I agree with the consequences, but I don't think that that you should be made to pay for the acts, pay the consequences of the acts that someone else committed. The other problem is there are a lot of white people who just don't give a damn one way or the other about civil rights.
Yeah, sure.
And they're going to be paying for this. You know, if you want to make people pay, I'll go along with you if you can get me the right people. You know, if you say that so-and-so shot your friend, then I might think, well, and they say, let's go kill him. Well, I might think, well, that's okay, we'll go kill him. You know? But if you say to me, so-and-so got killed, and one of those people did it, let's go kill him, I think I have a lot of problem proving to me that we should go just kill anybody.
This raises a very, very important question in my mind, and one that's really worrying me. I'll tell you about it. In my long session with Mr. Evers, he said over and over again, and I played the tape back a few days ago to be sure exactly what he said. He said, violence and bloodshed solve nothing. We must think of the future. We'll build a society that we can all live in, white and black. Birmingham was a disaster, is a direct quote. And these lines like that, with the notion of nonviolence, all sorts of pressures, but short of arbitrary reprisals. Now, a week later, less than a week, on the 17th of February, he made a speech in Nashville. Now, this was reported on the front page of a Nashville paper, and I was there on the 17th, so I had to leave town before his speech, so I didn't hear the speech. But this advocates non-selective reprisal. And reporters write this down, he says, according to the report of the Nashville Banner. Now, I don't trust any paper, having been a victim of it myself, so unless I was there, I won't take it. He says, if a Negro is shot in Mississippi, we will shoot a white man. Not one guilty or not one who has a symbolic role in that, but a white man, any white man. Next, if a church is bombed with children, we will bomb a white church with children. This is the direct quote. Now, I wrote him a letter. I said, I have the tape, I played it back to myself, and I'm disturbed by this shift of view. He's not the kind of man that just say something to me and then say something just to be, just to play it to an audience. There's some change of thinking that's taking place, some change of feeling, or something's happened. I haven't heard from him. I said, I can't print just your interview with me without reference to this. It looks slovenly and stupid on my part. I want to put them just side by side and make this out to be without explanation. I hope that you would answer me, give me a letter, try to explain what kind of accounts the shift of view. I haven't heard from him yet. I've been away since I've had time to hear from him. But I was deeply disturbed by this shift. I don't understand it, you see. This man's a responsible man in a responsible position. But he advocated then in this Nashville speech, quite clearly, not by implication, but quite clearly, non-selective reprisal. And I was really troubled by this on many counts.
Well, I might agree with him that violence and bloodshed itself, as an act per se, may not solve anything.
Yes.
But I think the consequences from violence and bloodshed may wake people up. I think that in many cases, it's inevitable.
Well, I think it surely is a grave danger of its happening. I think there's no question about that.
Yeah.
But that is different from the non-selective reprisal.
I'm not sure that I agree fully with him on the fact that bloodshed and violence solve nothing. It's true that Birmingham, Alabama was disastrous, etc., etc., but it's also true because of Birmingham, Alabama, there's a civil rights bill in Congress. So we're not quite sure that it was just, nothing. Now, it's unfortunate that 4 children had to die. But it would have been more unfortunate if some Negro had bombed another church with other 4 children, I would think. I would have to think that because you wouldn't be getting the right 4 children.
There are no right 4 children.
Right. That's true. That's the second thing.
Any shade of complexion in the world.
You wouldn't be getting the people who committed the act anyway. And I'm not sure that I believe in capital punishment. Now, my whole thinking was very shaken on the bombing of those 4 kids, because I thought, that John Donne says that the death of any man diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind. I read that when I was a sophomore in high school. It took me till I was about a sophomore in college to really understand what he meant and to really believe it. I do believe it. But I thought when those kids in Birmingham bombed that, yeah, I'm diminished, but they died for one reason. That's because they were black. No other reason. They were black. And that means I can die too just because I'm black. And that diminishes me even more because that makes the threat very, very close. See, the fact that 6 million Jews died in Germany is a horrible thing, both intellectually and emotionally. But it's more horrible if you're a Jew. And it's even more horrible if you're living in Germany at the time those Jews are being killed. So it becomes more horrible for me because I'm black. The decision is, how do you stop it?
It's bound to be more horrible. There's no way for it to be different.
I don't think that, I can't see, I've heard Charlie say a number of ridiculous things, I think. It seems like if I criticize everybody. But I don't know. I can't see someone saying something like that.
Well, I was disturbed in many ways because of the inconsistency here between these two things. Things are fluid. People do change their views because situations change. And I don't know what the line of events is between the 12th of February and the 17th.
Let's see, when did that girl get hit by the car in Jackson?
That was earlier. That was earlier.
Before
that was earlier, yes. I got there on the 9th, 8th or 9th. This is, I think, on the 7th that riot occurred at Jackson College. And he was then getting the students off the street.
Yeah, I remember that.
And there was a lot of criticism among some of the younger people because he had not let them demonstrate.
I disagree with his position on that.
Several kinds of some people said we wanted a big blow-up, a real riot, and then God out, then nationalizing the God. Some said this will be a change from the Big Bang. Therefore, we should live without it follow its course, whatever the bloodshed out of it. Some said that this would have, Godligus, Mrs. Richardson said that if they were taken off the street, they should have been into a nonviolent session right away with the songs and the prayers and the explanations of the purpose, and go right back out nonviolently, so that there'll be no bottling up of emotion and confusion of motive. They just send them off the street and nothing more was a mistake. But there are several lines of criticism that I've encountered on his policy there, or his behavior. I asked him, I said, is this related to the pressure that you are under because of that event? Now, this is an pertinent question, but I mean, it's in the cards to have that question aired, if possible.
Now, see, there are all sorts of problems with Negro leaders. See, a lot of them don't really seriously think about the problem.
Beg pardon?
They don't really seriously think about the problem. The whole problem of segregation thing. That's something you've got to watch. Merely because someone goes to jail 17 million times, or merely because someone's brother is shot, there's no reason why he should be selected to be a leader, it would seem to me. You should select leaders because they have good programs, because they show you some way that is likely to solve the solution, you know. But just because, you know, they've been to jail and they've got good hearts, you know, there's no reason to pick them for leaders. I'm very disturbed about that, because it seems a lot of people are coming to bloom as leaders because they're saying a lot of things. I was very worried about that speech
at Nashville?
No, the one that I did at the Nonviolence Seminar. Yeah.
Oh, here at Howard University, the one I heard.
Right, I heard a tape back of that. It seemed like I was really getting to the point trying to convey that Negroes don't really all love white people. You know, I decided, now I was saying that to counteract a lot of things that Nelson and King was going to say that night. You know, that nonviolence is the way. And that's not true, you know, that we have to show white people to love us, you know, because it seems to me that that's not true. I think the issue of nonviolence becomes very important in the question of solving certain things. Yeah, it's not true that it's going to bring us closer together and make us love each other. You know, it does it in certain cases, and I'm not going to deny that. Eddie Dickerson from Cambridge, Maryland, a white fella, 2 years ago dragged me off a stool and kicked me in the chest about 7, 8, 9 times, you know, and really gave me a good roughing up. One of the roughest times I've ever spent was at the mercy of his hands. And that same night he came back to the church, apologized, said he was sorry, and started working in the movement. About the last summer, he was the fellow who the white owner was smashing the eggs over his head, the white restaurant owner, and kicking. He was the same fellow.
What's his background, for instance? Is he an intelligent man with education? Or
no, he's not.
No education, but intelligent.
Well, I think he's, you know, I worry about people who can shift just like that.
Well, Paul,
that's right.
Saul and Paul, you know, Luther, it's happened.
He doesn't have formal education. He decided that, you know, he was wrong. He didn't have any right to beat us up. And he apologized to me personally and stretched out his hand, and I wouldn't take it, you know. I wasn't sure, you know. Somebody just doesn't come off stepping on you and then offer the hand to shake. Well, finally I took it, and he sat down. He said, you know, I'm not here to join you, he said, but I just want to tell you that the next time you're out there, you know, I won't be leading the mob, because I don't think it was right. Now, this happened personally to me twice. It happened once in Nashville when a white fellow did the same thing, and we all went to jail, and the white fellow did go to jail too. And he said, you know, I was wrong. He said, I don't believe in what you're saying. You can't change my mind. I'm going to be a segregationist till I die. But I don't think I should have been out there doing what I was doing. So, okay, that's agreed. And I agree. Well, okay, that's okay with me. That's fair ground. He said, now, don't expect me to talk to you. If you come out there next week and I'm in the crowd, I'll try not to be there. But if I'm there, don't expect me to say hello to you, or don't expect me to try and stop them, because I'm not going to do it. You know, that's their business what they do. And the next week, he came back to the church. He didn't show up for the demonstrations. He came back and he said, you know, he was pretty disturbed about it. And he thought there must be a better way. And he joined. We got him out of Cambridge and sent him to New York to CORE. and Core gave him some sort of nonviolent
Is this
training.
a Nashville man or you a man in
Cambridge,
Cambridge?
Eddie Dickerson, right. And I saw him early this fall and spoke to him for a while. He was still working with Core. I haven't seen him since. So he's become a strong person in the movement. But see, those are only exceptional cases. You know, I don't think that you're going to teach people through nonviolence. I certainly think as a tactic it's very useful.
Well, you apparently taught 2 people through nonviolence.
Yeah, you know, but there are a lot more people you've got to think.
Yes, but how much do these 2 cases mean? There's no telling what they mean, is there, really, behind?
Well, see, it seems to me that nonviolence has worked for about 4 or 5 reasons. The first one was that the South didn't know how to deal with it, so there was always publicity, and white people were very bad. The second thing was that we didn't have to justify our acts in the beginning. See, the white liberal element will justify all our acts for us. We were just students sitting reading books. So the white liberal element, and even the same fellow, I can't think of his name. I was trying to refer to him in the beginning. The fellow, I think he's from the Richmond Times. He wrote an article. He saw us sit in, and he said, this is exactly what I saw. And then he said, these Negroes came into the stores. He is a segregationist. He believes in separation of the races. And he said, at the very end, he said, there's one thing that bothered me. He said, I saw those students sitting very, very still, very, very quiet, not doing anybody any danger, except they had no right to be there, he said. And they're in the inferior race, he said. And I saw the superior race, he said, my fellow whites, yelling and taunting and spitting and acting like animals. And he ended the editorial. So, see, they had to justify our acts because they had to admit that even though we were wrong, if we were wrong, just arrest us and let it go with that. But see, the South is getting smart now. It's not doing that anymore in many cases. They're not going to be, they're getting smart. They're maneuvering through law courts. They're putting you in jail for long periods of times and charging tremendous bond money where you won't be able to get out. And they're making all sorts of legal procedures now. So they're beginning to deal and manipulate with you on your grounds. The other reason I think why nonviolence worked was because you had a small core of students. And you had a small core of students from Congress of Racial Equality, from NAACP, and they were all well-disciplined, well-trained students. But now you're not having that anymore. You didn't have that in Albany, you didn't have it in Cambridge, you didn't have it in Birmingham, you didn't have it in Jackson.
Ill-trained or not at all trained?
Not at all trained. You're having a mass movement, see. In the beginning everyone was talking about this is going to be a mass movement, but it wasn't. You just had about the same students that I saw in New York on a picket line, and the same students I saw in Mississippi behind bars, see. The same people I saw in Cambridge. But now there's a whole town of Cambridge involved, and you can't tell that whole town of Cambridge to be nonviolent. In Mississippi, it's not just 3 or 4 students on a bus ride. You're getting thousands of people to go down to register and vote, and you can't tell them that when somebody shoots into their house not to shoot back. See?
Shooting into a house, shooting back is very different from assassination in reprisal.
Yeah, well, I don't know enough for assassination and reprisal. I don't know. I haven't.
That's a very different act.
It certainly is.
Dr. Henry's now sitting there every night with the rifles at the window.
I know that.
I've sat there with him. Through long sessions with the rifles at the window, so I know what's happening there.
I know that. But it seems to me that when you have a whole town like Cambridge, how can you discipline them to be nonviolent? And what are you going to say to the people? You don't have the right to demonstrate for your freedom because you're not nonviolent, you're not disciplined. For instance, one of the hardest arguments that used to fight when the city movement first started was that people demanded that you wear a shirt and tie and a suit to go on a sit-in, and I refused to do it. And then the ultimate question was, are you going to tell me that I can't demonstrate for my freedom? So those decisions are going to have to be made. So that ground certainly is going.
But organization and discipline are required for the success of any movement whatsoever.
Certainly. So the problem is this movement so developed that it can discipline people? I don't think it is. Sincerely.
What's the next move then?
Well, I don't know.
The next move, organizationally speaking, or as leadership?
Well, now that creates a problem. I thought about that quite a bit. How do you get leaders of a movement? How did you get a John Lewis? A couple of people in SNCC sat down and voted for him. A couple of people sat down and voted for James Farmer. A couple of people sat down and voted for Roy Wilkins. Now when these people voted for them, they said, now this is your leader. People in Atlanta heard John Lewis speak, and they liked him. And so they said, well, I'll follow him. You know, they didn't say it verbally. As a matter of fact, they had a silent vote. They didn't say I oppose him, so everyone thought that they accepted him. And that was all there was to it. Same thing with Roy Wilkins. But now conflict arises because John Lewis says to Roy Wilkins, well, we don't think the courts are going to do it. We think we have to get out in the streets. And we think we've got to push hard. And conflict arises when Roy Wilkins says no. So people have to say, well, who are you going to listen to? You know. And the problem arises, what is the people in Detroit going to do? Are they going to listen to Roy Wilkins about what to do in Atlanta, or are they going to listen to John Lewis about what to do in Atlanta? You've got all sorts of problems creeping in there as to what is to be done.
That's part of the history of every movement, isn't it?
Yeah, and the other thing that you've got to worry about, and something that's beginning to bother me, is that you're going to start getting politicking inside of a movement. And that's bad, see?
Don't you have it already to a
You've got
degree?
it, but it's developing. It's really heightening now. And it becomes very, very bad, because once you have politicking within, you begin to lose focus on without, see? And that's bad. So the real way, I think, to become a leader is to develop a good program and present it to people. I think if you've got a good program, people follow you, if you make sense. But that means that you've got to start attacking all the rhetoricians. You know.
Now, some people, for instance, I think it's the secretary of the NAACP in Boston, with whom I have not talked. This is, I've read it. Said, I'm not sure it's he. Said that the trouble with the demonstrations now is that the element of overreaching has entered. So each one must be more dramatic than the one before. It's like American advertising. That the rational pressure is not the problem now of maintaining the rational pressure for a goal, but making each one a stupendous and more stupendous and the super stupendous spectacle. That you're caught in the advertising escalator, which is an irrational force operating within the movement.
Well, I think it's not only within the movement. I think it has to do a lot without the movement, too. For instance, 4 years ago, if 3 little students pulled a sit-in, every paper in the country would be there. Now, if 500 students pull a sit-in, nobody comes.
You mean this is a part of the general quality of American civilization, American journalism?
It certainly is.
That is, to get the attention, you have to put on a bigger and bigger show. So this movement is a victim then of the whole American psychology of colossal.
You tell them one person got killed, and that doesn't make a difference, you know. See, now, if 3 other people get killed, again, it won't make a difference, because 6 have already been killed. You're going to have to get 10. See? You're going to have to get 10.
This then raises the question of cold-blooded Machiavellian manipulation of risks and drama and violence, doesn't it?
And the question is, who makes the final decision?
It moves into that question. The logic of violence begins to emerge in terms of this process, doesn't it? The danger of violence.
The question still boils down to who makes the final decision.
Yeah.
And then if you do make it, how will you know that people will follow you? That is a problem. Now, I think my own personal feeling about Mississippi is that, see, you've got to keep pushing people to register to vote. You've got to keep pushing now. You can't slacken now. But that the whites are going to start pushing back too.
Clearly.
And then what's going to happen? Now, if you're really being honest with yourself, you're going to say, well, there is a strong, very, very strong possibility of violence. And you know it. Especially if you work in the Delta. You know, we've been shot at, we've been chased. You know what's going to happen. You say, well, should we stop? That seems to me the question. If you're going to avoid violence, and the way to avoid it is for you to stop. Since nobody else is moving forces.
The question of violence doesn't mean merely surrender of the issue, though, does it?
No, it doesn't mean
avoiding
it.
violence.
Right, it doesn't mean it. But the other question is now, if we stop this tactic, what other tactic can we use that will be as effective? Now, you can't deny the fact that publicity is great help in the movement. You can't deny that fact.
Sure.
It certainly is.
This leads to the fact that without a climate of opinion among the white people of the country,
right,
the movement can't succeed.
And that is why it becomes essential that you don't start talking preferential treatment, because that little fellow in Cambridge, Maryland, who says, well, that's because your face isn't black, means what he says. In the long run, he's going to not even hate Negroes because he hated them before. for whatever traditional reasons he had, but now he has something real to hate them for. They are putting him out of his job. Now that becomes an issue. See, now they're going to be fighting in the streets, and they're going to be fighting over jobs.
Yes, that's the. If this comes at a time of high unemployment,
rate. Absolutely.
it becomes really another picture entirely.
The other thing now is that poverty is becoming popular. Everybody's talking about poverty. It's so great, everybody talks about it. Nobody sits down and produces a program to solve the issues. I don't know.
How much is this matter a class matter and an economic matter behind the screen of race, of the race issue?
Well, now when I was in high school, I thought everything was economics. I was a freshman in college. I was convinced everything was economics. By the time I was a sophomore in college, G. Franklin Edwards, Dr. Edwin, sociology department, had a long talk with me, and we used to talk quite a bit. Well, everything isn't economics. There are other reasons, you know. If someone isn't realizing they're manipulated and they don't know that their actions are motivated because someone on top is motivating them, and this one, someone on top, is that article that what's her name wrote in the Nation about SNCC people mentioned power structure without knowing what they're talking about. Well, I don't know if she's precisely correct.
Power structure has become a cliche now.
Yeah,
Everybody uses it.
Power structure, revolution, demonstrations, and all these things. Freedom now, equality, human dignity are words I think that people just throw around without giving serious thought. See? Now, when you talk about power structure, you know, let's isolate. Let's see, Washington D.C. Right? We decided to have a rent strike in Washington D.C. We want to work on it. That decision was made, number one, because we think that there's need for emergency housing in the district. Tobriner gave a report to the Commission on Housing, etc., and said that there is no need. Now we feel that he's wrong. So we documented. People have gone out and made surveys. And we're convinced among ourselves that there is a need. There's a need to have rent control laws in the district, because there are none.
What do you pay for rent for this apartment, may I ask?
$77.50.
What is it, 2 rooms?
One little bedroom.
Bedroom and this room.
Right. Now,
That include utilities?
yeah, this is a good apartment, and it's a good price in Washington, D.C. A lady up the block named Mrs. Schuler pays $90. She lives on the top floor, and you can walk in the door and look right up at the ceiling. I've got all the...
Through the ceiling?
Right
sky.
through the ceiling, right. It rains and it leaks all the way down. She pays $90. Everybody else pays about $100, $125 in the building. Now that's clearly too much money. Miss Schuler is on welfare. The welfare cases in the district is handled very, very badly, because Congress handles everything. So you start saying, well, the way to solve these problems, to get the rules and all that, but you need home rule in the district, because clearly Congress cannot handle the problems of a growing metropolis as Washington, D.C. Now you got to decide, how do you get it? All right. You say, well, you can't get it through the courts because they've been trying that since 19 some odd years. All right. So then you decide, well, the other alternative as we see it is that of mass demonstrations, mobilizing people, dramatizing issues. Now there may be other alternatives. I'm not saying that they're not, but we see this one as the best one. So you decide to go out and have it. And when you talk about the power structure, you talk about the real estate board, because the real estate board clearly came out against home rule. You realize what it means if you have home rules. When we say we're against the power structure in Washington, D.C., we're against the real estate board on that issue. When you say you're against other things, you're against, low wages in the district for laundry workers, and you're against the owners of the laundry workers, clearly. So I don't think she's fair when she says that we don't know what we're talking about when we're talking about power structure. I think that we ought to, stop using those words. I agree with that. See, within the movement itself, there's terms for development and defining issues and terms clearly, because you're not getting away with what you got away with before. You've got to justify your own acts now. See, we've got to justify a rent strike. If it was a sin, liberal white element would justify it. We wouldn't even be asked. They just say, we understand why you did this. Isn't it terrible? And you just have to tell about the horrible treatment you got. But you no longer can do that. You've got to tell people in Cambridge why they shouldn't vote for an issue when you're getting a thing. I agree with Gloria's position. I thought that was a correct position. But you've got to justify your acts. And that's not being done. But it's going to be, I think it's being demanded that it be done. And that's why civil rights groups are going to be on the attack more and more. That's why preferential treatment will be under attack. You've got to justify preferential treatment.
That is, more and more, there are responsibilities of leadership that were not present even 2 years ago.
Absolutely right.
Another kind of leadership is in order,
Right.
which, with a more closely reasoned philosophy.
Yeah, and someone who's really taking his homework seriously, as we
That's
say.
what I mean.
Yeah, must take his homework seriously. You can't just get your name in the papers anymore, because the papers aren't going to say you're a good guy because you're a Negro. You know, they used to say that once. Now they're going to say you're not a good guy anymore. Matter of fact, you're an idiot.
Of course, the argument is now in some circles, some of those in which I move, if a white man criticizes any Negro's policy, someone turns on him, some other white person says you're another,
Bigot.
Southern bigot. This is another whole world of cliches, you see, and social pressures that moves around.
Well, we sure ain't a mix.
It's a mix.
We sure ain't a fix and a mix.
Well, shall we have some lunch? Good. We can resume then. This is the end of tape 2 of a conversation with Stokely Carmichael, March 4th.